Hey gang, Stephen Marshall, KYLandlordlaw.com, back with a brief update today. So when I was with you last time, I talked to you about the new procedures that are going on in eviction courts across the state when the case is based on the tenant's failure to pay rent. And just as a quick review, you now have two court appearances typically. On the first court appearance, if the tenant doesn't show up, you're going to get a judgment just like always. But if the tenant appears, the judge is going to advise you both of options for rental assistance, and is going to advise the tenant on the CDC declaration form, and is going to reschedule the matter for 2 weeks down the road. Now, when you come back, or any time in between, if the tenant signs that declaration form, the case is going to be rescheduled for January and perhaps later, depending on the court's docket. If the tenant doesn't sign the form, then you can proceed and get a judgment as usual. But as you might expect, at this point, lots of tenants are signing that CDC declaration form, and that means lots of cases are already being rescheduled for January, and lots of court dockets are filling up in January. Now, in signing that form, the tenant is making a declaration under penalty of perjury that he's using his best efforts to make timely partial payments that are as close to the full payment as his circumstances permit. And hopefully courts and tenant attorneys are emphasizing that duty to the tenants, that they have to try to make partial payments as much as they can. And so theoretically, what that means for you is that you're going to have a number of tenants coming to you trying to make partial payments. And that creates a bit of a dilemma for you, which I touched on briefly in my last post. If you accept their payment, you may waive your ability to evict in January at your scheduled court date, which means you would have to go back through the process of giving notice and filing a new case, and your case is going to be scheduled after all of these cases that are being kicked to January. So you may not be in court until February or March or potentially even later, depending on the volume that the court is having to deal with at that point. But on the other hand, if you refuse the payment, you don't get the money. And that is in short supply right now, to say the least. So, if you give up your spot in line, so to speak, for January, you're likely giving up another month, maybe 2 months of rent. But the reason I'm filming this video today is to tell you there is a way to accept the money and to proceed with your eviction without going back through the entire process of giving notice and filing a new eviction case. Partial payments are prohibited if a landlord wants to move forward with an eviction by KRS 383.675 in most cases. Now, that statute does not apply throughout the entire state. It's part of the Landlord Tenant Act. It only applies in 19 cities and counties in Kentucky, but they are the larger population centers. I'll link a post on my blog that shows you the 19 areas where the Landlord Tenant Act applies. So in those areas, KRS 383.675 prohibits you from moving forward with an eviction if you accept a partial payment. However, there is an exception, and that's when you and the tenant agree after the breach of the lease that you may proceed with the eviction despite accepting a partial payment. So you can potentially avoid that partial payment dilemma by requiring your tenants to sign an agreement as a condition for accepting their partial payment. And that agreement is going to explicitly state that you may accept the partial payment and you may proceed with your scheduled eviction case despite accepting their partial payment. And if they sign it, then you're free to take their payment each day, week, or month moving forward until your eviction case, and you can still move forward with your eviction case if the matter is not resolved at that point. Now, the tenant is not required to sign this agreement. And if they don't, then you're back to the partial payment dilemma. You're trying to decide whether the money that they offer is enough to give up your place in the January eviction line. Now, even in those areas where KRS 383.675 doesn't apply, courts often use equitable rationales to prohibit you from moving forward with an eviction if you accept partial payment. So even in those areas, this agreement will preserve your ability to move forward with the eviction despite accepting the partial payment. Now, I've created a form that you can use for this situation. It's a $150 form, but you can use it for all your tenants. You can customize it for each one and for each type of payment that they're making. Because the requirement of the CDC regulation is that they use their best ability to make partial payments that are as close to the full payment as possible. So you may have a tenant who comes to you with 90% of the full rent, but they may only come to you with $50, maybe less. If they don't sign this agreement, then you're stuck with trying to make the decision, is this partial payment worth giving up my place in line, which could cost you another month or two of rent? But if you'll have the tenant sign this agreement allowing you to move forward and accept the money, you can avoid having to make that decision. So if you want the form, shoot me an email, smarshall@trippleslaw.com. The last thing I want to mention today is that, again, most judges are not looking into whether the tenant is telling the truth on the form. It is the practice of most courts not to decide any issue unless it is absolutely vital to the case. And in this situation, unfortunately, most judges are simply kicking the case down the road, not looking into whether the tenant is telling the truth on the form. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that that's the right move. I'm making a descriptive statement on what courts are typically doing right now. I did have a case last week where a tenant advocate pulled up my blog post and tried to present it as legal authority on what courts should do. No, I'm saying this is what most courts are doing, not what they should do. What they should be doing is looking into whether the tenant's telling the truth in their courtroom or not. But the fact is most judges aren't doing that. And their position is that if you believe your tenant is not telling the truth, your remedy is to file a criminal complaint with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Now, it has been my prediction that the U.S. Attorney will not be prosecuting these perjury cases against tenants. But my update is I spoke to at least one rental owner who is going to file a criminal complaint. So I hope to have an update soon on whether the U.S. Attorney's Office actually prosecutes one of these cases. I have no idea whether it'll happen or not, but at least the ball is rolling and the pieces are in place for the U.S. Attorney to prosecute one of these cases or not. If a case was to be prosecuted and a conviction obtained, then that may impact how tenants conduct their business going forward, and we'll see less bad faith signings of the CDC declaration. Although I will point out, obviously, I think that would be a small percentage of people that are taking advantage of the situation. The rent numbers actually continue to be very good across the country. Landlords and tenants are working together, and most tenants are trying to pay at least part of their rent. So if you have an open eviction case and you want to preserve that case later in early 2021 and be able to accept partial payments, shoot me an email, smarshall@trippleslaw.com, and I'll get an agreement in your hand that you can have your tenant sign that will preserve that right to you. Things have kind of stabilized. I haven't given you as many updates. I still don't have an update on how the NAA case against the CDC regulation is going. Hopefully we'll have some type of resolution in that one sooner rather than later, but as always, the wheels of justice tend to move very slowly. If you have questions, as always, shoot me an email, smarshall@trippleslaw.com. Hope you're doing well. Have a fantastic end of your week.